Will Trump's victory help restore trust in American elections? In his latest Beltway brief, Blaze senior politics editor Chris Bedford argues yes, but more work needs to be done. So he joins us now to discuss. And Chris, let's start with the positives since we're on a high right now. How was last night a win for democracy?
So this was important, and actually, well, I'm rather thrilled with this result. It's not necessary that Donald Trump won for it. It could have been really anyone. Elections essentially need, in any kind of a functioning society, two different things in order to work. One, you need to be able to count the votes. That's kind of obvious. You need to be able to count them well. You need to have an honest brokerage system, or you end up not having a representative form of government. The second thing is that the American people, or whatever people are participating, need to believe that that is also the case. They need to trust in the outcome and not simply roll their eyes like Soviets do, what all the Soviets used to do, and all the different theatrical tricks that they played at representing the people. That is not a good way to have a functioning society, a functioning electoral government. And we learn this, especially when you try democracy and you just airlift it into random countries like Iraq that don't have a honest and trustworthy brokers in the government, and also don't have decades of institutionalized trust between the people and the government and each other and the ballot counters to make that election legitimate, to make it accepted. All of these things were really strained over the last couple of years in this country. A lot of Republicans, in particular, were feeling like they'd been disenfranchised. When you had a regulation bending, rule changing, and rule breaking, sometimes days, sometimes weeks long election with a huge amount of glitches and urban centers that tallied their vote far behind country places. So suddenly it would seem like, even if it was real, regardless of whether it was real, 100,000 ballot drop that favored one candidate from a city that was run by that candidate's friends, that undermined trust. But I'm not even making any judgments on whether or not that was fraudulent or not, whether it was whether it was all legitimate. It undermines trust to have it look like that. So to have an election last night that was finished well, unless you were watching CNN, well, most people were still awake, where you could watch it, where, to their credit, outside of places like Maricopa County, ballot counters in the cities kept pace with ballot counters in the country. To be able to watch this thing tick up, to have a decisive win, well, that's really important, regardless of which candidate won, for kind of restoring that trust. One of the people I ended up watching with the end of the night with was someone who hadn't voted this time because she felt that the whole thing was rigged. She ended up saying, well, not just because her candidate won, because of how swiftly everything happened and how seamlessly it seemed to, and how normal and American it seemed to happen, that this was proof that this could still be done, that maybe the COVID era was finished, that maybe lawyers being on guard and parties being ready and watchful and authorities being watchful could actually made a difference. And there's other couple things which are just perpetual boogeymans of elections that have existed since sometimes before this republic was founded. There's special interests. That has been an issue in America since the Constitution was drafted, when you had Southern planters who owned slaves versus Northern traders who didn't have the same objectives economically, and they would try to play their different candidates against each other, sometimes literally fight over which wars the United States was having. Also, moneyed interests. I mean, Kamala Harris spent $1 billion, raised and spent $1 billion. They got an advertisement on the Sphere. They were just burning money at the end. It must have been offensive to those Republicans who had 1/3 the amount of money they had. Now, it's easy and it's common since I was a child and well before that to cynically grumble, well, money just buys elections in America. Well, both of those things were undermined last night. That's not to say that sometimes powerful interests don't have a point. It's good to see an election where they have taken a side, where the money has taken a side. All of the elites have taken a side, but the voters still say no. That's a good sign, and it restores a level of trust and puts us back onto a path that I'm more optimistic about for this country.
Chris, that's well said. And I think a lot of Americans are feeling that, even if they can't express it today, that when they say, morning in America or something has changed, they feel like a return back to that structure that they can trust. Nonetheless, what else needs to be done? What didn't get done?
Well, there's a couple serious problems that you had with this election. One is and I hate to sound like a whiny liberal on this, but honestly, the rhetoric, I mean, there's an entire agenda that's being pushed by a lot of the elites in the United States, a lot of the global elites across the Anglosphere, across the European Union, and the United Nations. It's novel takes on sexuality and gender. It's novel takes on sovereignty, things that are fairly newly introduced. Novel takes on science and consensus. Novel takes on the environment and a man's stewardship of it and the effects of carbon. Novel takes on how people should be governed, whether parents should have rights, what schools should be taught. That's fine. It's okay to have different takes. It's okay to come up with new theories. But they've attached all these things to the concept of democracy. They say that this is the democratic point of view. I mean, a case in point was Viktor Orban in Hungary when he said that you were no longer allowed to talk about transgender stuff to children. The European Union called it undemocratic. So he held a public ballot and it won like 9-1. It was an overwhelming support from the public in favor of this, but it was still undemocratic. Not because it hadn't consulted the people, but because it had gone against these things. So if you go against these things, which are called democratic thoughts by these people who push them, then you're necessarily anti-democratic. Pushing that out there really does undermine it. If you look at all the pundits on CNN, MSNBC, ABC, CBS, New York Times, whatever, saying democracy is under threat, it makes more sense when you just replace that word democracy with my pet project is under threat. The opinions of the elites and the governance of the elites is under threat. Something that America has been subjected to for a very long time. I mean, in particular, since COVID. I mean, Richard Nixon could never compete with the level of elite control that he fought against that was exercised since COVID. And how much of that democracy was then pushed on us. It wasn't just we don't care what you think, America. It's not only we do care what you think, and this is what you think, America, and that's democratic. And this was a correction for that, but it's still a danger. And then there's also, I actually can't remember the second thing that ticked me off so much. Oh, yes, this is it. Kamala Harris. She wasn't picked. This is a dangerous precedent. I know it didn't go the way that Democrats expected it to go, but it's a very new precedent in modern politics. It's kind of old school in an American way for party politics, that the voters don't even have a say in who the nominee is. Mm-hmm. That if you don't think your nominee, who actually was selected by the voters, is going to have a good chance, then party bosses can replace them mid-race. That is a return to party politics in a way that may not necessarily be so awful, but it is certainly the opposite of what the progressives have tried to push with their electoral system and their democratic governance agenda.
Well, and so besides Kamala not being the one nominated by the people, what do you think differed between 2020 and today and this race?
Well, there's certainly some interesting aspects to 2020. I mean, you see Democrats across Blue Anon, which is their conspiracy theory groups on Twitter. They don't call it that. We like to call it that. Saying, well, what happened to those extra 12 million votes? Why was 2020 was such an aberration? The amount of votes that came out for the Democrats had not been seen before, and had not been seen after. This is the kind of thing that makes people raise their eyebrows and say, well, that's really interesting. It took so long to count. There was so little oversight. And where did those millions of voters go? That's something that's going to start tearing apart at the Democratic Party as they start to ask those very same questions. Where was this record turnout? I mean, also, they were lied to in a number of different aspects. Now, if you turn on CNN, I'll watch it for you. I'll tell you what's going on there. Yeah, you see people saying obvious things about Kamala Harris that you weren't really allowed to talk about and that weren't pushed at first. Like, well, she didn't have a chance to really put her feet under her. What are you talking about? She was the vice president for years. She didn't study. She even admitted that was one of her faults. She didn't do the work. She ought to have been recreating the King's Speech right there, just studying every day, getting ready for the role. Mm-hmm. And she wasn't at all. She spent all the time attacking in the wrong directions. Now they're willing to talk about that. Now they're wondering, well, what happened to this? Why were we told that there was an incredible turnout game in Philadelphia? Guess what? It turns out there wasn't a turnout game in Philadelphia. And the reason behind that is the progressives and the woke people who have taken over Philadelphia no longer use the unions that used to empower that machine, that used to power that machine. They no longer do any favors for them. They no longer work for them. They say, well, we don't need you. Well, as much as The women in the wool socks and Birkenstocks can absolutely control a library. They don't actually have the skills to shape elections and turn out the vote like these organizations, these largely previously Democratic organizations, had built up over the years to get the door knocks, to figure out which Democrats hadn't shown up and make sure they drag those people to the polls, sometimes under rather auspicious means. And that was something that was lacking in Philadelphia because a lot of those unions simply walked away. Powerful people in organized labor, like Trump, they have no friends in the progressives. It kind of reminds me of the way FDR tore apart the democratic machines in the cities and replaced it, centralized it all in the federal government. That was a big progressive plank back at the turn of the century. But it did hurt the democratic machines in the cities. They ended up losing some of these elections because that organized labor and that force was gone. And that's something that's happened. But I tell you what, with all that history and all that kind of weirdness aside, I'm loving this. I mean, just a minute ago, watching Kamala Harris's speech, I had it on and I put on YouTube In the Arms of the Angels and just watched as they showed the crowd and just pointed to the people that made me happiest to see them sad. And oh my gosh, it's wonderful, wonderful television to watch.
It is amazing. I mean, I'm going to listen to that adage about the stars and the billions over and over again. It's still rolling around in my brain.
Oh, yes.
I'm going to
Aren't
figure
you
out.
glad that you don't have to listen to whatever poet laureate she was going to choose for her inauguration? Who would have said,
Yes.
it's like, we fight for the skies and the fire burns for justice. And everyone would have applauded and pretended it was great. We're spared that for at least 4 more years.
Poetry, really. 60 seconds wrapping up here. I want to go to something that's really important. We're going to draw out more, I'm sure, with you in the coming days. But there really is something that remarkable that happened in terms of religious people voting and also abortion.
Yes, absolutely. So I think Kamala Harris overreached on abortion. I mean, this basically the case study that Americans, Republicans and Democrats, had an abortion is what it looks like on the ballot 7 weeks after the Dobbs decision. And it did have an impact. It was a driving force. But at the end of the day, when it comes to a presidential election, not representatives, not senators, abortion appears to have been relegated to a luxury issue, something that a lot of Democratic voters probably would be motivated by, and Republicans might even be motivated by, if they could afford to be. It's on the pyramid of needs. It is higher up than can I feed my kids. Our parish priest said that on Sunday. There's some aspect of this election. Are you worried about killing your kids or feeding them? Which is it? Which is pretty based, I actually think. But you saw more of that. You saw more strident Christian pushback on a lot of these aspects. Because at the same time, one of the key mistakes that she made with the Christian vote was coming out and saying there would be no religious exemptions. That means they're coming after Catholic charities, they're coming after Catholic hospitals, they're coming after Catholic doctors and nurses. This is something that we have carved out as like a peaceful place where you just don't attack religious institutions and religious people. You allow them to practice freely. And that was taken off the board. Kamala Harris was the most anti-Catholic presidential candidate that the United States has had in 70 years. It was a major step against the faithful and against Christians in general. And I actually think that did mobilize a lot of people who maybe find Donald Trump distasteful, who held their nose. I've actually seen a number of people who I know who held their nose, had never voted for him before, who said, I have to vote against Kamala Harris because her agenda is so uniquely anti-Christian.